Thank you. So just before I begin, I do want to mention there are some content warnings for my talk. There's going to be talk about blood, death, suicide, mention of homophobic attitudes in the 19th century. One of my slides contains a bit of nudity in a painting, and also there's going to be a couple of spoilers if you haven't read the text that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so today I want to begin with a bit of context for my lecture, which will hopefully ground my discussion. So I'll start with the question, what is a Gothic double? And as I do kind of have a think about famous Gothic double examples, feel free to pop them in the chat. So although we associate the double primarily with the Gothic, this mechanism, as Dale Townsend has explained, goes as far back as the origins of the Western literary imagination. It's traced back to, I quote, the dualism variously articulated by Plato and Aristotle, which was then very easily assimilated by the rise of Judeo-Christian theology. It is concerned, as Townsend further adds, with, I quote, metaphysical distinctions between body and soul, good and evil, and so on. Medieval morality drama, he points out, operated on the basis of a highly conventionalized depiction of virtue and vice. So you get, for example, Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queene and Milton's Paradise Lost as very clear examples of the dualistic dramatization of epic struggles in literature. But it's not really until the 18th century and the rise of Romanticism that the trope of the Gothic double comes into its own, as Townsend puts it. And although it is not exclusive to the Gothic, it's definitely a very Gothic trope. So Townsend looks at the famous Castle of Otranto and identifies it as a fertile ground for the development of the Gothic double and how it basically yokes together I quote, antithetical forces of the modern novel and the ancient romance, but also the crucial differences in dramatic mode. So comedy and tragedy, laughter and sublimity, and their attendant relations to class. So Romanticism alongside Gothic atmospherics provide the perfect terrain for the dramatization of the double, giving physical, often human or anthropomorphic, but not always, shaped to what is hidden, repressed, unspoken, or unspeakable, or variously demonized. Now, if anyone's thought of Dorian Gray as a classic example of the Gothic double, then that takes me to the second theoretical point that I want to address today, which is there a specifically Irish Gothic? And if so, is that a genre that tends to be drawn particularly to the mechanism of the Gothic double? And if so, why? So one way in which the Irish literary tradition tends to diverge from the English one is partly that it's got the Celtic substratum. Ireland has a very rich mythological substratum, which has endured in ways which for some reason have more or less eroded in England, and which have stimulated the Gothic and also horror imagination over time. Irish mythology is one mythology which has fed both horror films, such as the infamous Leprechaun and various iterations of the Banshee, but also dreamy and also somewhat eerie Gothic-y productions, such as Song of the Sea, which is really lovely. Jarlath Killeen explains that Irish locations also find their ways into Gothic horror or variously spooky films, such as Francis Ford Coppola's Dementia 13. So basically this underlying mythological richness tends to map out Ireland as what Killeen calls a zone of weirdness. Now, at the same time, we get a really complicated history of colonialism and the consequent formation of a class of people known as the Protestant ascendancy, or the Anglo-Irish later on. The ascendancy were the English settlers and their descendants, a class of landowners, members of the established church, that's the Protestant Church of Ireland, and their position in Ireland was very much solidified through very violent colonialism. Their status became formalized and embedded in the legal system roughly after 1691, through the passing of the penal laws, which were a series of highly discriminatory laws which targeted primarily the Irish Catholic majority, but also to a lesser extent Quakers and various Protestant dissenters from the established church. So one of these laws, for example, included the Education Act of 1695, which prohibited Catholics from sending their children to be educated abroad, or the Banishment Act of 1697, which essentially banned all Catholic Church officials and clergy from the whole of Ireland completely. This meant that by May 1698, all Catholic clergy were to be out of Ireland or face 1 year in prison followed by expulsion, with a second offence counting as high treason. So these laws were very much reactions to a climate of unrest that the ascendancy was facing, because there was this reality of living in a country with an overwhelming Catholic majority who hated them and wanted them out. For instance, that Banishment Act came in following the Williamite War due to fears regarding Jacobite support from Catholic clergy. So we get a situation where uncertainty, suspicion, animosity, hatred, and suppression all reign. And these are all very Gothic or Gothically charged terms. All these laws are meant to strengthen the Protestant establishment, and yet they all reflect a fundamental fear that lurks beneath the surface. Now, to top it all up, we have this ruling intellectual class living under the perceived threat of a religion which they saw not just as superstitious, but sometimes as downright demonic, especially in its sacramental focus, i.e., particularly the belief that the bread and wine during consecration literally become the body and blood of Christ. So this is something that they interpret as barbaric and akin to cannibalism and vampirism, which are again both very Gothic concepts. Now, of course, there is an inherent link between the Gothic and Catholicism that's not necessarily particular to Ireland. Think about the monk and just the general Gothic trope of corrupt Catholic clergy. But there's a very specific set of elements that converge in Ireland and which allow for the growth of this specifically Irish Gothic. So, as I've pointed out, there's the big problem faced by the ascendancy of a majority which opposes them, a situation which is quite different from England, because by the 18th century in England, there's already a solidly Protestant majority. On top of this, there's also a particular brand of Catholicism in Ireland, which weaves in elements of folklore, like all that banshee, leprechaun stuff. So there's this kind of folk Catholicism which blends elements of Catholic doctrine with folklore, such as the conflation of purgatory with fairyland, but there are many other examples. So there's a multi-layered underlying threat of things that are Gothic, uncanny, superstitious, and in some essential way dangerous to the Protestant ascendancy. And on the other side, there's this colonial imposition from them. And all these things make Ireland a Gothic space. This becomes even clearer, even more frightening in the late 18th century, when the penal laws are now beginning to be removed and the Catholic emancipation is underway. So in 1801, there's the Act of Union, and we get the abolition of the Irish Parliament. And all these things leave the Protestant ascendancy in chaos and decline. Many of them flee to London, and there's a crisis of absentee landlords. The threat from the majority becomes even more of a Gothic reality, but on top of that, at this point, you get the Protestant Irish having a sense of split identity. There's the Anglo-Irish identity. These people who are descended from the ascendancy, from the English settlers, but at this point, they've been in Ireland for a long time, were born here, grew up here, knew it as a home, and at the same time, it was a home that they didn't 100% belong to. So one good example of this is Sheridan Le Fanu, who I'm going to talk about later today, who in his early childhood experienced local violence in Maru in Limerick, where his father was made dean of the local church. But at the same time, he sees himself as Irish and he taps into Irish mythology and folklore. So then you have this class of people with a simultaneous sense of belonging and alienation, a split national identity, a loss of sense of purpose, a fear of the other, a demonization of the other, but at the same time, a serious questioning of what they're doing there, and a fear of the self as pointless. Now, add to this the flourishing interest both in Britain and in Ireland in the 19th century in stuff like spiritualism, spiritism, occultism, esotericism, all those things which question and challenge orthodox religious doctrines. And it becomes fairly clear why the Gothic flourishes in Ireland, and not just that, but particularly why it flourishes in Anglo-Irish Protestant circles. Now, mind you, there are Catholic writers in the Irish Gothic tradition, but and also Oscar Wilde converted to Catholicism, but ultimately the Holy Trinity of Irish Gothic, you get Maturin, Le Fanu, and Stoker in there, basically Church of Ireland. So given all these things, it's hardly surprising that this ambiguity, this complicated sense of belonging leads to the mechanism of the Gothic double becoming very relevant to Irish Gothic writing. Now, if Dorian Gray is a very popular example of the Gothic double in Irish writing, sadly not the same can be said by the novel, which is very likely to have inspired Oscar Wilde, namely Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Robert Maturin. Maturin was actually Wilde's great uncle by marriage, and while in exile, Wilde adopted the nickname Sebastian Melmoth after the eponymous Faustian character of Maturin's novel. It was published in 1820, and it's been broadly hailed as the last Gothic romance. The gist of it is that Melmoth strikes a deal with the devil and he gains 150 years of extra life. But the catch is that he needs to find someone to willingly exchange destinies with him. And failing that, at the end of that time, he will be damned. So he's left to kind of wander the earth, trying to find a victim to take over his curse. Now, at the beginning of the novel, we get John Melmoth, who's descended from Melmoth the Wanderer. He finds a manuscript and he finds a portrait of the Wanderer, and his uncle tells him to destroy the portrait. And I'm going to read out the scene where he destroys the portrait. The illusion subsided at length, and as the mind rapidly passes to opposite extremes, he remembered the injunction of his uncle to destroy the portrait. He seized it, his hand shook at first, but the mouldering canvas appeared to assist him in the effort. He tore it from the frame with a cry half terrific, half triumphant. It fell at his feet, and he shuddered as it fell. He expected to hear some fearful sounds, some unimaginable breathings of prophetic horror, follow this act of sacrilege, for such he felt it, to tear the portrait of his ancestor from his native walls. He paused and listened. There was no voice, nor any that answered. But as the wrinkled and torn canvas fell to the floor, its undulations gave the portrait the appearance of smiling. Melmoth felt horror indescribable at this transient and imaginary resuscitation of the figure. He caught it up, rushed into the next room, tore, cut, and hacked it in every direction, and eagerly watched the fragments that burned like tinder in the turf fire which had been lit in his room. As Melmoth saw the last blaze, he threw himself into bed in hope of a deep and intense sleep. He had done what was required of him and felt exhausted both in body and mind. So I think it's clear when we see how he tears and hacks the portrait, how Oscar Wilde incorporates this scene later on in his novel. But beyond this parallelism, there is a multi-layered doubling mechanism here. And each of these layers is very rich in theological anxieties. So on the one hand, we have the correspondence between Melmoth the Wanderer and his portrait. Now, the context here is that John Melmoth has recently been told that the person represented in the painting, his ancestor, is still alive despite it being painted in 1646. Reminder, this is 1820. So if normally the portrait is a kind of making immortal of a person, kind of memorializing, the dynamics is reversed here. The portrait is perishable and the focus falls on how it's made up to be a thing in the world. We get the mouldering canvas, we get fragments that burn like tinder, so it's made into the materials that make the object rather than the But the man represented is actually alive and has been monstrously so all the way from 1646. So when the narrator stresses the horror felt by John Melmoth when destroying the portrait, we get a feeling of dreadful anticipation of the real monstrosity of Melmoth. So if the portrait is only a static depiction of him, what is the original really like? And then there's the duality of John Melmoth and Melmoth the Wanderer, linked together by name and ancestry, so by blood. And again, in this duality, there's another implicit theological duality, which entails a mirroring between Melmoth the Wanderer and Christ. In her book, God and the Gothic, Alison Milbank characterizes the Wanderer as an anti-type of Christ due to his parody and inversion of salvation. So she draws attention to the idea that Christ leaves behind the scriptures and Melmoth leaves behind a web of tales, because the narrative is a narrative of nested stories. But this mirrored symmetry goes beyond just textual references. It also concerns the balance between spirit and matter as embodied by Christ and Melmoth. So in his sacrifice, Christ remains spiritually intact, but his body is maimed by how he's mutilated and beaten by the soldiers who crucify him. After his death, he's resurrected and goes straight up to heaven. So his bodily presence, according to Protestant doctrine, is just no longer a part of this world. Now, a similar but reversed mechanism is at play in Melmoth's condition. So there's a transference of sin, as with Christ's sacrifice, only that if Christ takes people's sin onto himself, Melmoth attempts to pass on his sin onto others, basically reversing the redemptive sacrifice. If Christ stood disfigured and mutilated on the cross, Melmoth's body remains unchanging for those 150 years. He also leaves a very clear physical trace in the world, which is John Melmoth, his ancestry. So both Christ and Melmoth disappear physically from the world. Christ goes up to heaven, ascending, and Melmoth is presumably dragged straight to hell at the end of the novel. But Melmoth's lineage, his ancestry, endures in a physical manner through his descendant. So although John is innocent, he has a terrible inheritance linking him to the Wanderer's satanic pact in what tends to be a physical hint at the Adamic tradition. So John's image shows that humanity is tied to Adam through original sin. His ancestral relationship with the Wanderer reinforces this idea that human nature is physically linked to the idea of sin. So there's obviously the sense of making physical, making present, embodying the concept of sin in Melmoth, but not a particular kind of sin, but rather the whole idea of sinfulness itself. But that also means that if Melmoth is an embodiment of sin, he can also act as a Gothic double to anyone who encounters him. So basically, when anyone sees him, they see the idea of sinfulness reflected and through that recognize their own condition. So for example, we get the image of a Catholic priest, Father Olavida, and in this scene, Maturin uses that Gothic mirroring to kind of articulate some of his problems with Catholic doctrine. So we get Melmoth, who's described as the Englishman, coming and meeting a bunch of guests following a wedding, and the Catholic priest is there, and I'm going to read from the novel. As the wine was presented to him, Father Olavida, who, as I observed, was a man of singular sanctity, prepared to utter a short internal prayer. He hesitated, trembled, desisted, and putting down the wine, wiped the drops from his forehead with the sleeve of his habit. Donna Isabella gave a sign to a domestic, and other wine of a higher quality was offered to him. His lips moved as if in the effort to pronounce a benediction on it and the company, but the effort again failed, and the change in his countenance was so extraordinary that it was perceived by all the guests. He felt the sensation that his extraordinary appearance excited and attempted to remove it again by endeavoring to lift the cup to his lips. At this point, dramatically, everyone sits down apart from the priest, and symmetrically, Melmoth stands up. So we get Melmoth and the priest standing up, mirroring each other. Father Olavida then pointed his arm to each of the company and asked each individually, "Do you know him?" "No, no, no," was uttered with vehement emphasis by every individual. "But I know him," said Olavida, "by these cold drops," and he wiped them off, "by these convulsed joints," and he attempted to sign the cross, but could not. He raised his voice, and evidently speaking with increased difficulty, "by this bread and wine, which the faithful receive as the body and blood of Christ, but which his presence converts into matter as vaporous as the suicide foam of the dying Judas. By all these I know him and command him to be gone. He is, and he bent forwards as he spoke and gazed on the Englishman with an expression which the mixture of rage, hatred, and fear rendered terrible. Now, we don't get the end of he is, because the priest in shock collapses and dies instantly, but we can think that he's probably saying he is Satan, but also he is me, because of that perfect mirroring. The symmetry between Olavida and Melmoth is emphasized by the fact that everybody else is explicitly and ritually excluded from the interaction, as the priest proclaims that nobody else knows Melmoth apart from him. And he knows him in a very kind of visceral, intimate, and horrific kind of way. As he shouts, "By these cold drops, by these convulsed joints," the priest is in fact turning to himself, to his own body, and its instinctive reactions to express this very corporeal and intuitive knowledge of Melmoth. It's almost as if he's possessed by Melmoth, who rises up as a horrific recognition of his own inner reality. And this is horrific because, as I stated earlier, Melmoth is the embodiment of sinfulness. So Olavida's recognition of Melmoth's demonic presence is a mirrored apprehension of his own condition, which shakes him to the core and kills him. But before collapsing in the shock of self-recognition, in the physical infernal mirror, which is Melmoth, the priest performs a very theologically significant gesture. He bends forward as he speaks, gazing on the Englishman. So we recognize in the language of gazing, of course, the idea of gazing in a mirror, and this is confirmed by how bouncing off Melmoth, we get the gaze back onto the priest and his expression. So we get him, always him, because this is ultimately about him and his own corruption. And as he does this, he bends forward in a physical gesture, which helps us visualize the Lutheran theology of the homo incurvatus in se, which means man bent upon himself. Luther viewed the idea of sin as man bending in towards himself and away from God, a kind of self-focus, an image which the priest's movement perfectly captures as he bends forward towards Melmoth in this performance of the double. Now, I'm not going to have time to discuss this in a lot of detail, but there's also at the end of the novel a very interesting eco-Gothic doubling between hell and the ocean, because Melmoth has a dream that he's going to be damned, and he sees hell as this kind of infernal fiery ocean in which he plunges, and to which he's actually plunged by some kind of supernatural clock arm of divine justice. And then after he wakes up, he vanishes into the real ocean, the description of which perfectly overlaps that of his dream. Okay, so I think it's time to take a quick break now before we move into the next section, and I'm happy to look at the chat and answer any questions. Yeah, so that ties in very well with the next section of my talk. And just before I get to Le Fanu, I want to mention that now we're kind of moving forward into the 19th century. And we get this whole fascination with the idea of mirrors, which become more of a central object of fascination in society. And at this point, we also get the emergence of photography or proto-photography, basically the daguerreotype. and spirit photography, which develops hand in hand with a growing interest in spiritualism and its ambition to make spirits material, to demonstrate their physicality. Against this background comes Sheridan Le Fanu's fiction, and although he's pretty dismissive of the spiritualist movement, he's definitely interested in making the immaterial material and turns to the occult theology of Emanuel Swedenborg, which he weaves in with his sometimes underlying Calvinistic worldview. This is where the novel Uncle Silas comes in. So the very first paragraph of the novel sets the tone for a great range of dualities, false appearances, and weird correspondences through the theme of a portrait. So we find the narrator Maud in a pretty a la carte Gothic setting in which she's looking at this wall full of portraits, and I quote, many old portraits, some grim and pale, others pretty, and some very graceful and charming, hanging from the walls. Few pictures, except portraits, long and short, were there. Now, at the point of the publication of Uncle Silas, 1864, Le Fanu was very immersed in the occultism of Swedenborg, who was this eccentric Swedish theologian. He believed that he could talk to angels and demons, and that he could travel freely between heaven and hell. And Le Fanu drops many hints, some more and some less explicit, at Swedenborgism or Swedenborgianism. No one agrees what the right term is, so I'm using both just So one of the main precepts of Swedenborgian theology is the idea of correspondence. There's a lot to say about this, but just to give you the crux of it, there's a very clearly established divine order in Swedenborg's vision. Everything proceeds from God and is then replicated imperfectly in a lower order. So every layer of replication is a less perfect reflection of the one above. So we have God, who's the absolute, and then we have heaven, which is a manifestation of God, but it's less pure. And then we get all this kind of layer after layer after layer of reflection that continues all the way down to our world. And there's a world of spirits in between us and heaven. So it's through this kind of web of correspondence that knowledge is carried through from God and through to humans. This means that what emerges from Swedenborg's vision is a vision highly driven by symbolism, with a qualification, which I'll get to in a minute. This focus on symbolism is made even stronger by Swedenborg's insistence that human beings cannot grasp any kind of abstract truth without the prop of the material. So, for example, he says the sun in the natural world is akin to God's radiance in the spirit world and in heaven. So through this logic of hidden meaning in correspondence, Swedenborg goes on to radically reinterpret the Bible and also to read everything as having this layered meaning. There's a literal meaning to everything and also an inner meaning. So if you look at a horse, for example, the literal meaning is that it's a horse, obviously, but then if you're enlightened and seek the truth, you will actually discover that it represents divine wisdom, and so on and so forth. So this also means that often the thing and its literal meaning is just an appearance, and our understanding can move up the scale of correspondence by first experiencing this appearance and then looking at what it can teach us about the actual reality. So if you take the sun again, it's a reflection of the sun in the spirit world and a reflection of God's love. So if humans experience light and warmth through the senses, they can harvest that instinctive knowledge and move towards a more enlightened state. There's degrees because there's all these layers. Crucially, these are not mere symbols, and that's why I said there's a qualification to symbolism, but they're actually manifestations of the plane above. So when Maud looks at these portraits in the room, what's in each of them? They're all layered representations of something. And then her gaze focuses on one particular portrait, a girl of a little more than 17, looking, I believe, younger still, slight and rather tall, with a great deal of golden hair, dark grey-eyed, and with a countenance rather sensitive, was sitting at the tea table in a reverie, I was that girl. So it's through her portrait that we actually first encounter Maud, when we first learn what she looks like, what her age is, and that she's also struck in a reverie, which is quite important to Le Fanu. Victor Sage writes, I quote, I is doubled, always represented, subject and object. The paradox comes when the speaker says, I believe, and we wonder immediately about this qualification and the break with the former self it implies. She now cannot re-enter because there are limits to what she can know. How can you know you looked younger than 17? Total honesty would refer not just to the mirror, but to the opinions of others. End quote. So there's this kind of weird warp in the sense of self and time of Maud the narrator. This is a doubling which, through the simple contemplation of the portrait, gives us the perspective of the Maud who has now lived all the events that she's about to narrate, who's reached a different level of knowledge about her own story, and then the other two Mauds, the one contemplating the portrait before she's about to live all the events, and the Maud in the portrait who's static and unchanging. I was that girl, she says, not I am that girl. So there's a gap that opens up there in her experience. This is the key to why Victor Sage believes that the portrait is not just there for visual effect or for a sense of realism. He says, the device is not just naturalistic. The rhetoric of portraiture is a textual maneuver that lies beyond her point of view. She is to fall in love with one of these portraits, the portrait of Uncle Silas. In the meantime, the picture of herself speaks, I was that girl, and the gap between present and past is revealed even as it is crossed. So we have a series of correspondences in Maud's own sense of self and in her timeline. So we have the Maud in the portrait, who is a manifestation of the Maud at the beginning of the novel, who is also an appearance of the narrator Maud, who has now drawn the inner meaning of her own story. So it's not surprising then that the Maud in the story is often presented as naive, as quite childish. She's kept in the dark by her father, by her uncle, and she's moving towards her own revelations as she experiences the horror of her attempted murder. And then she's moving forward towards the final revelation, but she's also moving back towards the Maud in the portrait, the one in the state of reverie, who's ignorant and is representative of the actual Maud when she first looks at her own image. Now, a reverie would usually refer to a pleasant daydream, an agreeable state, but for Le Fanu, it's sometimes, not always, but sometimes more complicated. And he uses it to suggest something a bit more sinister in that kind of Swedenborgian correspondence system. It's a state where you're removed from that inner hidden meaning of things, a dream state. The reverie, etymologically from the French rêve, which means dream, is a dimming of reality, a state of confusion. It's a moving away from that Swedenborgian inner meaning and in towards the world, a bit like when Father Olavida bends upon himself, but with added occult Swedenborg symbolism. So it's not surprising that the reverie Maud is that one that's inside the portrait, in a sense trapped inside her own image. What happens afterwards is that Maud's narrative takes the shape of a negotiation, with the active Maud again moving forwards towards understanding, but also backwards as she doesn't really understand what's going on, vacillating between the two. And as Sage points out, she's both subject and object. And it's this duality that further influences her perception of reality and particularly of her Uncle Silas. So she becomes obsessed with him through seeing his portraits around the place, and she's drawn to them, attempting to construct what kind of a man Silas is from her perception of his paintings. So she looks, for example, at one painting and notices that there was a remarkable elegance and delicacy in the features, but also a character of resolution and ability that quite took the portrait out of the category of mere fops or fine men. When people looked at it for the first time, I have so often heard the exclamation, "What a wonderfully handsome man," and then "what a clever face." She goes on to describe Silas as having a refined masculine force in his slender oval face, shadowy eyes. So if we think back to the portrait of Melmoth, which was a kind of monstrous but toned down anticipation of the real thing, the portrait here in Le Fanu is more of a distorting mirror, because it turns out that Silas is not this kind of, wonderful, elegant, lovely man, but actually a pretty nasty piece of work. Contrary to that image in the portrait, which at some point actually convinces Maud that he is a really lovely man, despite people accusing him of, well, not being so nice. So Le Fanu's mirrors and doubles do point towards a real reflection of the thing, but they also have the potential to be highly distortive and therefore highly dangerous. And at this point, there's the idea of seeking knowledge and enlightenment that's wrought into the question too. Maud, as many of his other characters, need to try and move beyond the appearance or the representation and get to the crux of the thing to find that hidden occult truth, which is often a dreadful one. Although in Uncle Silas, Maud does get lucky and survives, partly because this is more of a symbolic text rather than one dealing with the actual supernatural, which is not so much the case for the next thing that I'm going to talk about, which is the collection In a Glass Darkly. It was published in 1872, and it comprises 5 short stories, or if people are pedantic, 3 short stories and 2 novellas. Green Tea, The Familiar, Mr. Justice Hallbottle, The Room in the Dragon Volant, and Carmilla. These were mostly published elsewhere, basically in serial form, but were collected under this volume. So I want to talk a bit about the title, In a Glass Darkly, and how it brings the stories together. It's broadly believed that the title is a deliberate misquotation of 1 Corinthians 13:12, which the King James Version of the Bible renders as, "For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known." So I think we can see at this point that there's a sense of something Swedenborgian in this passage already, in its representation of this life and its experience as somehow a dimmed down version of heaven or the beatific experience, when clarity will be achieved and the glass covering our eyes removed. Now, there's some added ambiguity in the biblical passage, because the Greek word esoptro, which the King James Version translates as glass, could be read as referring to either a mirror or a lens, with many biblical scholars tending to agree that it's more likely to be a mirror, which has actually led to subsequent translations rendering it as mirror rather than glass. And it's this mirror metaphor that Le Fanu taps into. Since we're talking about translation, I find it really fun to look at how book titles have been translated into foreign languages. And In a Glass Darkly in French is Les Créatures du Miroir, which is The Creatures in the Mirror, which is a perfect Le Fanesque rendering, I think. In connection to this mirror metaphor in Le Fanu, Victor Sage talks about how it twists St. Paul's metaphor for the nature of perception after death, that we shall see through a glass darkly, converting glass to mirror and trapping us on this side of it. This reflects primarily darkness. Think back. So this reflects primarily darkness. It reflects the world's darkness back to itself. And as Sage points out, darkness is a pretty charged concept for Le Fanu, encompassing secrecy, conspiracy, ignorance, barbarism, violence, horror, superstition, potentiousness, and even allegory. All in the dark, he notes, is one of Le Fanu's favorite phrases. This manifold sense of darkness is fundamental to Le Fanu's theology, which is often based on occlusion. There is nothing that is ultimately revealed in any satisfactory sense, and that's probably why this ultimate lack of revelation has led some critics to talk about Le Fanu in terms of nihilism. But I think Le Fanu always gives us just about enough tantalizing information about what's beyond to issue that nihilism. And this is where the second sense of the mirror comes in, that double, that reflection, because it reflects human nature back to itself, but it also reflects the supernatural back to human nature, forcing people to view that sense of immanence. So apart from the Corinthians misquotations, there are two other sources for Le Fanu's title that my research has brought up as being quite significant to Le Fanu. One is a passage from Wilkie Collins's novel, No Name, where the governess, Miss Garth, ponders over the nature of the two Vanstone sisters. And I quote, searching as in a glass darkly into the two natures, she felt her way, doubt by doubt, from one possible truth to another. And this is exactly how the characters in Le Fanu's stories work their way up to truth, well, some possible truth or another, from doubt to doubt to doubt to a sense of possible truth. Going back to Wilkie Collins, it might be that the upper surface of their character was all that she had thus far plainly seen in Nora and Magdalene. It might be that the unalluring secrecy and reserve of one sister, the all-attractive openness and high spirits of the other, were more or less referable in each case to those physical causes which work towards the production of moral results. Wilkie Collins was aware of the writings of Swedenborg, and Le Fanu was certainly aware of Wilkie Collins's No Name because he actually reviewed it in 1863 for the Dublin University magazine. And although he is fairly critical of Collins's style, which he describes as a rather poor imitation of Edgar Allan Poe's, it's likely that something about this passage struck him as Swedenborgian enough to catch his attention, especially that passage which refers to the duality of human nature as a struggle between two drives, good and bad, and especially as they're physically represented in two people, two sisters, so kind of mirrored. And on top of that, framed through the voice of Miss Garth, which is a bit like the framing mechanism of In a Glass Darkly, which is framed through the narrative of Dr. Hesselius. And then there's another source on which Le Fanu is likely drawing, which is E.T.A. Hoffman's The Sandman, one of the best examples of the uncanny, where it's said that perhaps too you will then believe that nothing is more wonderful, nothing more fantastic than real life, and that all that a writer can do is to present it as in a glass darkly, which is what Le Fanu does, but which is how he also presents the reality of his characters. So he adds this kind of metaphysical dimension to the writer being in a glass darkly. Now, I'm not going to have time to discuss all the stories in this collection, so I'll look at the most striking examples. For example, in Green Tea, we don't get necessarily a portrait itself, but we do get a demonic monkey spirit which haunts Reverend Jennings and which mirrors his gestures back to him, imitates him, mocks him, and drives him to complete madness in the end. We also get one scene where Dr. Hesselius first meets his patient Jennings, who has been studying the writings of Swedenborg, and that scene is entitled Four Eyes Read the Passage. So there's a clear link between Swedenborgian occultism and the mirror, but also between the idea that the eye, especially the inner eye, which Jennings has had opened in the story by his consumption of green tea, and the sense of the hidden truth. Now, the link between mirroring and Swedenborgian revelation becomes clearer in Carmilla, but I'll get to that in a bit. Before that, I just want to talk about the story Mr. Justice Hallbottle, which is often actually overlooked in criticism. And we get a judge who is put on trial and sentenced to death by his own monstrous doppelganger, significantly named Mr. Justice Twofold. His name clearly suggests that he is the monstrous double of the judge, and his very appearance is an exaggerated, caricatured version of the judge, not unlike the grotesque physical appearance of Dorian Gray's portrait later in the century. Mr. Justice Twofold is a personification of Judge Harbottle's evil, ungenerous nature. Indeed, he is put on trial for sentencing a prisoner to death unfairly. At the same time, he is also a mirror, forcing Judge Hallbottle to experience himself and his own cruelty as one of his victims. It places him face to face with the actual reality of his own being, and it's a not very nice one. So the grotesque doppelganger sentences the judge to be hanged at the grotesque doppelganger sentences the judge to death by hanging, which is to happen on the 10th of March. Now, as that fateful day comes to fruition, the judge is found hanged at the top of the staircase in his own house. The story ends with characteristic Le Fanuesque ambiguity. The death is proclaimed to be a suicide, but the narrator adds, to those who are acquainted with the strange story which Judge Hallbottle had related to at least two persons, and we get the number 2, which is, again, that sense of duality there. The fact that the catastrophe occurred on the morning of March the 10th seemed a startling coincidence. So it seems as if we get 2 possible ways of reading this. One is that the judge died of his own hand, or the other is that he was hanged in fulfillment of the sentencing. But at this point, because of that mirroring mechanism, we need to ask, are these 2 options really separate, or are they actually 2 sides of the same coin, mirrored reflections of each other? Because ultimately, the judge probably died because he was sentenced to death, otherwise we wouldn't get that ambiguity. But at the same time, that means that he did die of his own hand because he was sentenced to death by his own self, by his doppelganger, by Justice Twofold. So it is as if once faced with his own monstrosity, the only possibility is death. And then this also complicates the way he contemplates that self-monstrosity. On the one hand, Judge Hallbottle, looking at his doppelganger, and sees this revolting grotesquerie, sees his own corruption take physical shape. But at the same time, it's important to remember that Justice Twofold is also part of the judge's self, right? So the mirrored image also sees itself in the mirror. So the doppelganger looks at his own self on trial and decides to sentence him to death. So sentence himself to death. As a judge in this position, he is faced with the legalistic injustice of his previous actions. He sees from this privileged point of view the imbalance of his past decisions which have in fact shaped him and due to which he is now this very monstrous doppelganger. The only possible conclusion of this double crisis of monstrosity and injustice is death. So there's a sense of Calvinistic predestination here and as a kind of self-fulfilled prophecy, a bit like that in green tea. So we get the judge's fate being inescapably driven towards death by the confrontation of his own abjection. The way the double is staged here, at some level at least, takes away his free will, because the double, Justice Twofold, is not just a mirror, reflection, or a painting, but he's actually an active force of his own, with his own apparent free will. Judge Hallbottle has virtually no control over what his monstrous doppelganger does. At the same time, the whole raison d'etre of Judge Twofold is to force Hallbottle to witness his own monstrosity. So therefore, his decision to sentence him, or himself, to death seems inevitable as the wills of the 2 judges seem to negate each other and be driven towards this inevitable fatalism in the end. Now, another important thing to consider in the story is the maid who serves in the judge's house and who is actually the wife of the prisoner the judge unjustly condemned to death. She receives a letter from her husband and she says, "Oh, he wants me to send him money to fee a counselor," she said, while her eyes wandered over the pictures on the wall and back again to the looking glass, and certainly she did not look as if his jeopardy troubled her very much. Basically, it seems as if every time there's a hint of darkness, and I'm using darkness here in that manifold, complicated sense, which Victor Stage attributes to the term, the leitmotif of the portrait and the mirror comes up. The woman knows she's doing something wrong. She's betraying her husband and essentially doesn't care that he's going to be sentenced to death. And yet she doesn't. But at this point, she looks at the pictures on the wall, and then she looks in the mirror and then back again, suggesting this back and forth movement of her eyes from the paintings and the mirror and back, as if these objects have the real power to reveal a reality to her that she might not perceive otherwise if she just analyzed herself. So she needs this external projection. There's a break after Looking Glass, followed by the qualification that she certainly didn't look as if his jeopardy troubled her very much. So this could be the voice of the narrator telling us readers that she seemed unbothered, but even this isn't that reliable because this is the voice of Dr. Hesselius, who is pretty unreliable himself. But it could also be us getting a view of her own thoughts, as if she was seeking a confirmation from the way she looked in the mirror that she really didn't care very much. It's the kind of fleeting Swedenborgian version of the Snow White myth, where the queen seeks confirmation that she's the fairest of them all, but with the maid seeking confirmation from the way she looks in the mirror that she's unbothered, so kind of physical confirmation. Actually, it turns out in the end that she did care. So there's again that sense of false appearance in the mirror. Okay, so I'll now move on to Carmilla, and I'll start with the scene where Laura is looking at a portrait, and she sees in the portrait a lady who looks a lot like Carmilla because, well, she is Carmilla. But Laura says, "Carmilla, dear, here is an absolute miracle. Here you are, living, smiling, ready to speak in this picture. Isn't it beautiful, Papa? And see, even the little mole on her throat." So there's this irony in this passage because she's talking about Carmilla living in the portrait, but we know that Carmilla's undead, so the symmetry between life and death or undeath. And also she talks about a miracle, which you would associate with God, but Carmilla's, well, a vampire. So it's a bit more complicated than her life being a miracle. But in the uncanny portrait, there's this distance established between subject and object again. And the clear resemblance draws attention to Carmilla as an othered being. Patrick O'Malley has noted that Carmilla goes through a series of identifications as foreign. He talks about an epistemological problem of determining the boundaries of the domestic and the foreign, which grows into a crisis of personal identity, and in the problem of discriminating the self from the other. And he looks at this passage, "I live in you," Carmilla murmurs to Laura, "and you would die for me, I love you so." The personal pronouns here shift ground with a terrifying perversity. One would expect that Carmilla would say, "I would die for you, I love you so," yet she tauntingly predicts the inverse. Likewise, even a reader who knows that Carmilla is draining Laura's blood would expect the teasing hint of her vampirism to take the form, "You live in me," that is, your blood continues to flow in my veins and thus transmutes your life into my eternal life. That was a quote from Patrick O'Malley. So the focus shifts from life to death, and in a way Carmilla's monstrosity emerges from this fact and from the idea that she is unable or unwilling to give back to Laura, fashioning herself as a kind of ultimate parasite who can only drain, while Laura only gives herself to Carmilla. So Carmilla is not unlike her own portrait, unchanging and static. If in Dorian Gray we get a symbiotic dynamics between him and his portrait, in Carmilla both remain struck out of time. The idea of trappedness is reinforced by what the general describes as the logic of the vampire, that she has to refashion her name anagrammatically so that Melarca becomes Mercala, becomes Carmilla. She is confined to her name, confined to her body, in the sense she is entrapped, indeed framed like a portrait, existing within its own reality, bound by its own logic, and always a representation or reflection of a deeper, truer reality. So if the portrait is a representation of Carmilla, Carmilla is in a sense also a portrait herself, and in her vampiric state, a representation of death, but maybe of other things as well, as we'll see in a bit. Now I'm going to turn to Patrick O'Malley again. He talks about the lens of imperfect knowledge as an ultimate alterity. He says that the human condition is constituted as a dark glass through which the glimmers of the sacred can be faintly and imperfectly detected. Yet Le Fanu's version switches the position of the object of the viewer's interest. The ghostly and imperfect flickers of unmediated knowledge are still contained in the distorting and darkening glass, but now rather than being a lens through which the object can just barely be seen, that glass has become a mirror, and the object of desire of imperfect but necessary knowledge, and in fact, in Le Fanu's vision of the Gothic, has become not the radical other, but the self. So O'Malley is introducing the concept of the sacred into the equation now. So now if you read the relationship between Laura and Carmilla in terms of a theological metaphor, considering the situation which I've just described above, that Laura only gives and Carmilla only takes, what emerges is that Laura is a sort of Christ for Carmilla. This is reinforced by the sacramental way in which Laura gives herself to Carmilla. There is obviously the aspect of blood consumption, echoing the idea of the wine in the communion ritual becoming literally the blood of Christ, and being drunk. And this is again taken to be literal in Catholicism, and the novella is set in Styria, which is a Catholic region of Austria. At the same time, in her erotic self-giving to Carmilla, she also gives her body to her, so further echoing the Eucharistic sacrifice. But this kind of high sacramental theology is kept in check by the Swedenborgian metaphor of the entrapping mirror, which includes the vision of the beyond. So although Laura can appear as a Christ type to Carmilla, we see this as readers by observing the kind of mirroring relationship, but she herself is kept in the dark. Not in the least by Carmilla herself, actually, who knows that for Laura's sacrifice to work, she needs to remain ignorant of her vampirism. So there's clearly the idea that there's an imperfection there, that Laura is somehow trapped, but also that Carmilla is somehow trapped. Carmilla does at times use the Gothic mirroring mechanism to try and gain Laura's trust and to assuage her fears by instantiating a false symmetry between them too. So at the beginning of the story, we learn of an episode which Laura had dismissed as a dream from her early childhood, but which probably wasn't a dream, in which Carmilla visited her and fed on her. When they are reunited, Laura instantly recognizes Carmilla from that dream, and Carmilla obviously knows that Laura would recognize her and be frightened. So she comes up with a false symmetry. How wonderful, Carmilla says. 12 years ago, I saw your face in a dream, and it has haunted me ever since. Wonderful indeed, Laura says, overcoming with an effort the horror that had for a time suspended my utterances. 12 years ago, in vision or reality, I certainly saw you. I could not forget your face. It has remained before my eyes ever since. I felt reassured. So Laura feels paradoxically reassured by this false double that Carmilla comes up with. Normally, the Gothic double, as we've seen, tends to be uncanny, sinister, monstrous, and frightening. But now Carmilla creates a kind of double that actually assuages Laura's fears and reassures her. This doubling means that Carmilla's presence is made apparently safe because it makes Laura's dream make sense, and it creates the impression that a reciprocity exists, the kind of reciprocity that actually doesn't take place because Carmilla never gives her own blood back to Laura, so that fluidity isn't established. So there's an illusion of safety instantiated by Carmilla's use of the Gothic double here, and it's a fake double. And Carmilla is in many ways a fake double. But I think that's where paradoxically the possibility of transcendence comes from. So I'm going to turn to the contemporary Irish theologian William Desmond, who talks about the false doubles of God as having the potential to awaken people's mind to that very possibility of God because they somehow imitate God. sometimes in weird and monstrous and unexpected ways. So he talks about human beings as existing in the between, and the between would be, and I'm quoting from Desmond now, a matrix of metaphysical and ethical ambiguity wherein desire is enticed by, though it need not fall to, the false doubles of God. And this, I think, is very useful in understanding theologically what's going on there in Carmilla. So Carmilla, in a sense, becomes a false double of God. She's a false double of many things, but because of that, she's a false double of God. Carmilla makes Laura aware of death, just as the false doubles of God make people aware of God, so that she also makes Laura aware of the transcendence of God and treads the ambiguous line between the sacred and the monstrous. And she also reflects Laura's own Christ-like character back to herself and to the readers. Now, Alison Milbank talks about Le Fanu's work as fostering a feminist theology through the use of the death and the maiden motif. Where there's Gothic entrapment, and there's always Gothic entrapment in Le Fanu, the maiden can lead beyond death. The motif shows usually a maiden dancing with death, and during the Reformation, there was always a stress on death arriving through or because of Eve and because of her role in the fall from grace. So the idea of the embrace between death and the maiden is usually monstrous. For Le Fanu, it brings together fleshliness and the supernatural. And through this, Milbank suggests he tries to push his characters out of their catalepsy, out of that state of reverie that we've seen with Maud and Uncle Silas as well. It reveals death as porous, but also as something real rather than a nihilistic void. And in Carmilla, it becomes a kind of fulfillment, a natural erotic progression, or as Alison Milbank puts it, a form of evolution. Because at some point, Carmilla says that in this life, girls are, girls are larvae that become butterflies. Girls are caterpillars who become butterflies in the next life if they die as lovers. So on the one hand, there's the idea of entrapment that threatens, and a kind of entrapment that threatens to repeat itself over and over again, trapping Laura in a kind of death in life, as Milbank suggests. But there's also the revelation of the beyond through erotic experience. And if Carmilla mirrors Laura back to herself, well, Laura mirrors Carmilla back to herself as well, which is possibly why Carmilla is the final iteration of the Countess Mircalla, because Laura does something there. Now, William Desmond views the erotic as linked to our experience of ourselves as beings which transcend the carnal, and so also as beings that move beyond death. The way we are drawn to sensuous beauty is the same way we are sensible to death, he says. A situation which mirrors how Laura is drawn to Carmilla, who embodies both sensuous beauty and death. This leads to intimate signs of the universal within our carnal selving. So in a way, the erotic is a way of understanding the human as a transcendental being. And Eros, Desmond explains, I quote, drives beyond its own lack because it seeks the ultimate other, end quote. And this is a model of ultimately seeking God as the other too. Now, in a way, because of Carmilla's predatory nature, she cannot seek the ultimate other. But in a way, paradoxically, that's exactly what she does, because she's the ultimate other of Laura. She's a vampire, she's different from her, and she seeks to ultimately completely possess her body and blood, to incorporate the ultimate other that Laura is into herself. But there's also a sense of recognition. And I mentioned that Laura acts as a Christ-type figure to Carmilla in her sacrifice. And although Carmilla remains predatory, there are very kind of brief, fleeting moments of vulnerability in her when she almost wants to open up to Laura, almost to confess the story. So, for example, she says, "I dare not tell my story yet, even to you. The time is very near when you shall know everything. You will think me cruel, very selfish, but love is always selfish. The more ardent, the more selfish. How jealous I am, you cannot know. You must come with me, loving me to death, or else hate me and still come with me, and hating me through death and after. There is no such word as indifference in my apathetic nature. So obviously there's the kind of possessive, selfish love that Carmilla gives to Laura, but it feels as if Laura is getting to her and she's got this instinct to open up, to tell her story, even though she dares not say it even to Laura. In showing this vulnerability, she shows a desire to be known lovingly by Laura, akin to that quotation from Corinthians, that the beatific vision involves being known. So to give her story, to be seen and to be loved. It's a brief fleeting opening up, and she immediately falls back into her predatory nature. Oh, you will come even if you hate me. But if Carmilla won't give back to Laura what she takes, if she's not the Christ type that Laura is to her, she can give her a sort of mirror, acting as a Swedenborgian type of Eve to her. Now, if in Death and the Maiden motifs during the Reformation, Eve was a pivotal pawn in the narrative of the fall, in Swedenborg's theology, she's a much more positive figure. So at some point in Swedenborg mythos, Eve sees herself in a crystal fountain, and she perceives her soul as a goddess, which then opens up to her the relation between the inner and the outer meaning of things. Gradually, she starts developing into a very wise interpreter of all these symbols and correspondences around her. And she's told, although thou art still a damsel, yet as I see, thou clearly comprehendest. So Eve grows into her clarity, and at some point she sees all the network of correspondences. Then she looks into the mirror again, and she sees her face, and from her face emerging a chain of reflections all the way to God. So from her reflection through a chain to basically God's own being. And she's told, look now from the mirror and see what is the quality of order itself, and in what matter the spiritual principle shines forth from the natural, and the divine from the corporeal, consequently the whole of order. And then Eve enters a meditative state where she's basically able to see all the mutual discourse of the universe. Now, in other Death and the Maiden tropes in Le Fanu, he makes it super clear who's Death and who's the Maiden. If you take Laura Silver Bell, which involves another tale of supernatural seduction, get this kind of terrifying fairy lord who seduces Laura, and it's made clear that he's Death, Laura's the Maiden. In Shalkan the Painter, Rose is the Maiden, and this creepy dead looking painter is Death. But in Carmilla, because of the mirroring and because Carmilla is also female, there's more ambiguity. Obviously Carmilla is Death, but she's also the Maiden, in a sense reconciling the two Eves, the fallen one and the wise Swedenborgian one. And in being a mirror to Laura, in this sense, opens up Laura's own vision towards this chain of reflections. And unlike previous characters in the collection who die of their own hand, Laura doesn't, but actually she looks away from the mirror and following Carmilla's death finds herself in a reverie. But this is a different kind of reverie. It's closer to the meditative state of Swedenborg's Eve. Laura no longer belongs to the world of the dark mirrors in the same way. Yes, she's still in it, but she's no longer innocent or ignorant. Instead, she's fixed in her reverie, longing and remembering the presence of Carmilla, both lovable and terrifying, two attributes which Le Fanu always associates with God himself, as if in a constant anticipation of her own death, and therefore a fulfillment of becoming the butterfly, right? So I think this is one of the most interesting examples of how Le Fanu uses Eve's mirror and its occult Swedenborgian symbolism to move from the erotic to the revelation of transcendence, and from the monstrous to the sacred, and to direct the gaze away from the mirror, even if he never quite tells or shows us what is behind it. A bit like in that cave that M.R. James talks about. So this is the end of this section. So I'm happy to take a break and have a look at comments, answer questions before we move on to the final section. So Now the next section is on Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is going to be quite short actually, but I want to stress the fact that in several takes on the vampire myth, the vampire has no reflection in the mirror, and this can be traced back to Stoker's novel, where in Dracula's castle, Jonathan is shaving and then he sees in the mirror the whole empty room behind him, but no sign of Dracula, although Dracula's right behind him. Many critics have read this as suggesting the fluidity between Jonathan and the Count himself and the homoerotic dynamics between them. But essentially, the Count is not seen in the mirror because if we read the novel metaphorically, he's not really there, but he's a mere projection of everything that Jonathan would have repressed. When talking about oppositions in the novel, again, Patrick O'Malley notes how what might seem like a series of Manichaean oppositions are actually mirrored reversals. O'Malley crucially uses the language of the mirror to explain the fluidity of opposites, which turn out to be hidden inside each other. He gives a series of apparent oppositions, such as vampire human, Catholic Protestant, violator and enforcer of gender norms. As they collapse into one another, the key is that the vampire doesn't have an actual reflection in the mirror because he exists as a projection of what's on the other side. He's not in that sense an independent individual, but rather that which each character has hidden, suppressed, repressed, variously so inside themselves, whatever that might be, and it can be different things for different characters. So Dracula doesn't actually need a reflection because he already has one. He's part of the self. So when Jonathan sees himself in the mirror, he also sees the vampire, the monster lurking inside of him. Now, again, religion and sexuality are two of the main themes that are being mirrored and doubled in Dracula. And Patrick O'Malley talks about how the scene between Mina and Dracula basically, on the one hand, may evoke fellatio cunnilingus, but also at the same time pointing to the traditional iconography of Christ as pelican, slicing open his chest to feed its babies. Now, what happens is that in the exchange of blood, they become literally the same substance, and this is a great theological metaphor. And again, there's a move from the monstrous to the sacred, but I'm not going to talk about that now because it's not super different from Carmilla. It is different, but not, I've already spoken about that dynamics. However, what I want to mention is that in his working notes on Dracula, Stoker wrote a list of vampire traits, and one of these contained a reference to photography and how the vampire would appear as a skeleton. So not quite the invisible entity in the mirror, but rather a physical shaped, yet stripped back to this essential skeleton form. We know that a photograph is in some way a mirrored image, a reversed image. Now, it's unclear why Stoker decided not to include the reference to the camera and photography in the final novel. Maybe he thought it didn't fit in logically with him having no reflection in the mirror, but appearing in photographs. But anyway, the idea of the skeleton is consistent with the kind of visual culture of the memento mori that's in full swing at the end of the century, and suggesting again that the Count is not just an embodiment of death, broadly understood, but actually an embodiment of one's own mortality. Faced with the Count, the characters become aware not as much that death is a thing, but they become aware of themselves as mortal beings. A bit, again, like Carmilla. It's almost as if the Count is an ever-shifting foil character to the conceptualization of mortality for each of the novel's characters. At the same time, his own identity, Patrick O'Malley notes, is brought to the forefront by this very lack of reflection, because when Jonathan is shaving, he's startled by the Count who's behind him, but he doesn't see him, and he ends up cutting himself, bringing out blood, and blood is inherently linked to the idea of the vampire. So now I'm just going to quickly move on to Oscar Wilde. And one important thing to remember is that the Gothic double is a complex mirroring mechanism and not just a mere allegory. So it's not simply the Manichaean opposition, but rather there's a fluidity that becomes very clear in Oscar Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray, the quintessential fin de siècle Irish Gothic doubling text. I'm going to turn back to Patrick O'Malley again, who talks about how Wilde uses the Gothic double to probe out the relationship between Catholicism and a range of erotic experiences. Now, if in Maturin's earlier Gothic, there's usually a sense of being driven towards a sense of Protestant orthodoxy, a tendency which O'Malley also attributes to other examples from the English Gothic tradition, such as Mary Elizabeth Braddon, Wilde paints a completely different picture. Sorry. To him, paradox fosters, and I'm quoting again from Patrick O'Malley, the possibility of conflating orthodoxy and heterodoxy, both sexual and religious. In a sense, as Wilde embraces both his homosexuality and Catholicism, he comes to embody everything that radical Protestants viscerally feared in the second half of the 19th century, basically homosexuality and Catholicism. But the thing is that they often feared them both together as if they were somehow inherently interlinked, inextricable doubles of each other, two sides of what they saw as the same deviant coin. For a bit of context, during the 1830s and 1840s, a religious movement known as the Oxford Movement forms in the Church of England. And they were very much drawn to Catholic aesthetics and also Catholic doctrine. Now, basically, it's been broadly suggested that particularly male homosexuals in the 19th century found a sense of belonging in this Anglo-Catholicism as a way of expressing a sense of difference, both aesthetically, symbolically, and doctrinally. An idea which certainly echoes O'Malley's observation that Oscar Wilde conflates the two in the idea of the Gothic double. Now, in Anglo-Catholic circles, there was an emphasis on religious fraternity and very close-knit friendships between men, as well as a focus on priestly celibacy, which wasn't a thing in the Anglican Church. Now, because of this, hostile voices found a way to criticize them both, and they basically employed a very homophobic discourse to attack them both on their sexuality and on their religious beliefs. So in their eyes, they were simply just deviant, religiously deviant because they were sexually deviant, and sexually deviant because they were religiously deviant. So it's as if the two were somehow interlinked. One example of this is Kingsley basically using a very kind of homophobic discourse against John Henry Newman. So in light of all this, we can see how the picture of Dorian Gray channels these two sides of Oscar Wilde's own being and reclaims them. He's a writer attracted to men and to the high church aesthetics of high Anglicanism and eventually Catholicism. As Patrick O'Malley notes, this makes not only the portrait, but the novel itself a Gothic mirror, which reveals the anxieties and fascinations, the relationship between sexuality and religion, held on Oscar Wilde as fin de siècle writer. Now, I want to look at the passage where Dorian is kind of fascinated by the Roman ritual, and I'm going to read from Wilde. It was rumored of him, Dorian, once that he was about to join the Roman Catholic Communion, and certainly the Roman ritual had always a great attraction to him. The fuming censers that the grave boys in the lace and scarlet tossed into the air like great gilt flowers had this subtle fascination for him. As he passed out, he used to look with wonder at the black confessionals and longed to sit in the dim shadow of one of them and listen to the men and women whispering through the worn grating the true story of their lives. So partly due to this passage, and Dorian's focus on the Black confessionals, critics have often read the novel as a sort of confessional text itself. Now, what's really interesting to notice at this stage when Dorian is fascinated by the confessional is that his Gothic double, the portrait, is already changing. It's happening, right? So he himself remains unchanged. When he's looking at the confessional, there's a contrast between one type of mirroring and another. There's the religious mirroring established in the confessional between the person confessing and the priest. They are essentially in a mirrored scene, the screen of the confessional symmetrically separating them, but also obscuring the priest's face, bringing the focus back onto the penitent, whose own voice echoes back to them, and all their sins are mirrored back to them in a very striking and jarring manner. At the same time, there's a sense of transcendence and redemption in the very act of confession, because the whole point of it is forgiveness, which is usually delivered unequivocally by the priest uttering, "I absolve you in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit." Now, in the portrait, this duality is both replicated and lost. The painting changing in consequence to Dorian's crimes is, in a sense, a visual representation of the penitent confessing their sins, hearing their own voice jarringly. So the portrait is Dorian's confession, speaking out his actions. It's a witness. The portrait echoes the space of the confessional, which Dorian muses over, so much so that he indeed covers up the portrait, therefore mimicking that hidden space that's the confessional, hidden away from the view of others, where the world outside is covered up and sins uncovered. Significantly, the first time Dorian notices that the portrait has changed, he decides to cover it up, and he looks around, he finds this coverlet, which is described as being very large, of purple satin, heavily embroidered with gold, a splendid piece of late 17th century Venetian work that his grandfather had found in a convent near Bologna. So this drape, this coverlet, possibly having served as a pall for the dead, also reminds of some of the curtains used in confessionals, such as the one in the picture on the screen, which is purple and lush, much like that drape that he hangs on the portrait. So this creates a three-way parallel between the space of the painting as a confessional space, safely shrouded away from the world, but also the space of the portrait as a space of death. It's the quintessential space of the Gothic double, where a myriad of things come together in many ways. Drawing together the space of redemption with that of death, the portrait hints at both salvation and damnation. The thing is that, at least at this stage, neither of those are in actuality. They exist as mere possibilities. It's a kind of Schrodinger's cat game with Dorian here, both possibly saved and possibly damned, so long as the double exists, because the double suggests that the other side, the holy sacred side, still exists. And the metaphor of the confessional makes this sort of theological fluidity possible, but there's more complications. One complication relates to the concept I spoke about earlier, that the priest in the confessional pronounces the absolution. And this is something that Dorian cannot do himself, because the double is himself. So basically, the kind of theological anxieties explored in earlier Gothic writing, such as Justice Hallbottle, reach their apogee here, because there's the lack of mediation. Dorian likes to study his portrait, half fascinated, half horrified, but he cannot fulfill the mediatory function for himself that the priest does in the confessional. So long as there is only him and his portrait, so him and himself in the confessional, he remains trapped in a Le Fanu-esque type of mirror in a glass darkly. That's why there's, I think, an emphasis on how, when he observes the confessional, the men and women there tell their true stories. In contrast, Dorian's true story is not unfolding, it's not being told, because his secret remains hidden, and therefore his true story is actually equivocated, not heard and not seen by anyone apart from himself. Now, as the plot progresses and his secrets grow deeper and more sinister, Dorian's need to share his secret, to confess it, also seems to grow deeper, a bit like Carmilla when she wants to confess. But he still cannot break free of the violence that has now taken root inside of him. The impulse to confess, the theological drive to atonement, is also monstrously doubled by his impulse to destruction, which also leads him to his most heinous crime, which is the murder of Basil. He feels the need to show Basil the portrait, but then it's engulfed by his drive to destruction. But after Basil's murder, his compulsion to confess does not disappear, actually driving him to blurt out to Campbell that he has murdered Basil. And then again to fall back into his own devious drives and end up blackmailing Campbell into getting rid of the evidence, which is destroying Basil's corpse. Now, there's another aspect of confession that I want to talk about, and that further ensures the fluidity between the theological and the erotic in the picture of Dorian Gray. The act of confession is, in a primary sense, a very intimate act. It's a laying bare of the self in front of one single witness, the priest, but also God by implication. There's a vulnerability in the act of confession. There's a sense of embarrassment, but also of trust. It's almost like being naked, definitely spiritually naked in that intimate space, hidden away from the world. The complete laying open of the self, the physical and spiritual closeness, the trust, the intimate space, all these carry the echoes of an erotic encounter. The lush drapes framing something away can suggest not only the space of the portrait or that of the confessional, but also the space of a bedroom or even a bed, if we think of the kind of lavish four-poster bed used in fin de siècle Victorian aesthetics. Now, actually, significantly, the description of Dorian Gray's own bedroom has that sense of the lushly adorned aesthetic of the curtains which cover the portrait. So it's described in terms of him having a newborn feeling for luxury, and he had decorated his bedroom with some curious Renaissance tapestries that had been discovered stored in a disused attic at Selby Royal. So there's this sense of lush drapery. And it's the same newborn feeling for luxury which he admires in the Roman Rite. So it's almost as if he makes his own bedroom into a confessional. Now, there's another thing that's always constant in that intimacy in the confessional, and that's the priest. And in Catholicism, the priest is always a man. And well, that would have been the case in Anglicanism in the 19th century as well, but Anglicanism doesn't have this kind of sacramental ritual of confession. So the theological impulse towards confession and redemption is also in Dorian Gray a kind of homoerotic impulse, and is itself a kind of hidden secret which sidesteps the straight male gaze, because this sense of erotic intimacy with a man might be lost on a straight male reader. So when he's driven to show Basil, when he's got the confessional impulse towards Basil to share his secret, and when he's compelled to tell Campbell that he murdered Basil, he's affirming both his theological impulse towards confession and redemption, but he's also seeking out to achieve a sense of homoerotic intimacy, to establish a space of shared understanding, to be seen, to be heard, to be known, and to be forgiven. And it's not coincidental that he feels this compulsion specifically towards Basil, because there's already some kind of fluidity between them, because Basil painted the portrait himself. So already established some kind of intimacy with Dorian when he sat for him, especially when we think of his affirmation when he was painting Dorian. And I quote from Basil: "Every portrait that is painted with feeling is a portrait of the artist, not of the sitter. The sitter is merely the accident, the occasion. It is not he who is revealed by the painter. It is rather the painter who, on the colored canvas, reveals himself. The reason I will not exhibit this picture is that I am afraid that I have shown in it the secret of my own soul." So it's not just Dorian's soul that's in the portrait, but it's also Basil's soul that's in the portrait. There's this fluidity between Dorian and Basil, and there's the suggestion that Basil has walked himself into the picture of Dorian Gray, that he's in the portrait bound up with Dorian in a quasi-erotic and quasi-theological manner. In light of the fluidity between painter and sitter, between Dorian and Basil, then Basil's destruction seems necessary in the destruction of the portrait too. Paradoxically, his murder is the first step in Dorian's redemption and reunification of the self. The question is, why can't Dorian achieve either the theological or the erotic sense of recognition, of being heard and seen and known and forgiven? Why does he end up having to resort to murder and blackmail instead? The answer lies in the Gothic double itself. He cannot achieve any sense of peace either with man or with God, so long as his life is mediated or unmediated through the portrait. He cannot achieve completeness in relationship to man or to God, so long as his very self is split. The portrait is an obstacle, a very physical obstacle that needs to be eliminated. Now let's go back to the scene where I talked about the description of Dorian Gray's bedroom. What follows is that he is very vexed and startled by the presence of the portrait at the entrance. I quote, "As he was turning the handle of the door, his eye fell upon the portrait Basil Hallward had painted of him. He started back as if in surprise. Then he went on into his own room, looking somewhat puzzled." So there's the safety and intimacy of the bedroom being threatened by this monstrous presence of the portrait. And mind you, at this stage, perhaps only threateningly monstrous, for it hasn't undergone all the horrific changes. It's just slightly changed into a cruel smile after Sybil Vane's suicide. Now, the only way to overcome this constant symmetrical self-determination between Dorian and his portrait is the reunification of the self. The portrait needs to cease being a monstrous double and go to being just a painting that does not carry inside it the soul of either painter or sitter. A kind of portrait that's a bit like the one described by Maturin at the beginning. There's just a canvas, there's just material, paint, and nothing else. That's why, as I've mentioned, Basil's death is essential to Dorian's final untangling himself from the portrait and regaining his own full self. But of course, this also makes Dorian's own death an absolute given, the basic gravitational force of the novel. But in restoring the portrait to its beautiful state, it gives up its history of monstrosity. It becomes a mere image, giving back to Dorian his past, his sins, but also his passions, his love, and ultimately his selfhood. The difference between, say, Mr. Justice Hallbottle, which doesn't allow us to see parts of the mirror, and the picture of Dorian Gray, is that in Wilde's text, we get a sense of reconciliation because Dorian destroys the portrait in contrition. The paradox of the double, the portrait restores Dorian not to an idealized self. And when I say idealized self, I mean either the self that has been idealized by other people or the self-idealized self, but instead it's restored to a complete person whose individuality emerges neither as a monstrous man that was in the painting, neither as the perfect beauty that Dorian embodied, but as a complicated man with his own dualities and drive towards both destruction and redemption. The monstrous portrait forces Dorian to take responsibility for his whole self, and in its destruction lies Dorian's restoration. So it's through his confrontation with his individuality as it is, comprising the fluidity of his humanity that had been split up, that he finally aggregates the self and performs the ultimate act of redemption through that unification of the self. And that's it. And I hope I've given you an overview of how the Gothic double has been used in Irish Gothic writing in the 19th century, although I must say I've only basically just scratched the surface, and there's a lot more. And if people want reading recommendations or want to chat or ask any questions, do drop me a line. I'm always happy to hear from people.